Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cardiac Grand Rounds on November 1st. Today, we are going to have Dr. Joon Lee and Dr. Khara Sauro present Making Data Work for You, Implementing AI-Based Clinical Decision Support Tools. Just a word, next week, we will not be having a Grand Rounds. The session will be canceled. Dr. Lee, welcome.
All right, good morning, everybody. So I'm Joon Lee, and Khara and I are here today to talk to you about making data work for you, implementing AI-based clinical decisions for cardiac care. I'll be talking for the first 15 minutes or so about the AI stuff. And then after that, I'm going to hand it over to Khara so that she can talk to you about implementation science. Cooler than AI. So first of all, let me just give you a brief overview of our research project here that underpins what we're going to talk to today about. So we're basically trying to develop an AI-based tool to support coronary revascularization decision-making coronary artery disease. Basically, the tool will provide decision support information for deciding between PCI, CABG, or medical therapy only. And we are applying machine learning to a really rich data set coming from the approach registry and the linked administrative databases. And that part is just the AI part. But what I think what makes our project more interesting is the second bullet point here, which is to involve stakeholders throughout the project so that we maximize the chance for the tool to be adopted in real world practice. And we're not trying to build a tool that just interests us, but something that's going to be really useful clinically in the real world. And we have established an advisory committee of patients, clinicians, health system administrators, and industry partners to be able to do this. And this project is being funded by a CIHR project grant and Alberta Innovates ACE Concepts grant. So, before we go any further, I just wanted to do some groundwork here and talk about what is an AI-based clinical decision support tool. In order to talk about that, we need to start from what AI is. And most people, when they hear the term AI, they usually think of the gentleman you see on the left side, the Terminator. But in reality, today, what is actually possible is more like what you see on the right side. On the right side, you have this photo, and you have a bunch of different objects in the photo. And now we have the AI technology has matured enough so that it can actually detect objects within an image like this and tell you like where those objects are and what those objects are, as you can see here. So this is a very common application of AI that you see nowadays. So basically, these are the two types of AI. So the one on the left side, the Terminator, is an example of artificial general intelligence. So basically, this is a human-like intelligence, and this is the holy grail of AI research. This is the end goal that everybody wants to get to, but we are very far from it. And in fact, we don't actually know how to build one like that. So we have ways to go to achieve this. So for now, what is possible is something called narrow AI, which an example of which was, what you saw on the previous slide. So these types of AI can only do one task, and what they learn to do cannot be transferred easily to another task, even if that task is similar to the original task. So from that sense, the AI is not that intelligent. It can only be taught to do one specific thing, and it does a really good job on it if it's trained properly, but that's the only thing that it can do. And we have several successful commercial products now that are in this realm of narrow AI, and obviously we saw an example on the previous slide. So how do you build an AI? Well, so there are different methods of doing that, but as you might have heard, the best way to build an AI is through machine learning. And those other methods to build an AI usually don't work that well. So And machine learning has really pioneered some of the recent innovations. So that's why everybody talks about machine learning all the time. And this is exactly why people usually use the terms AI and machine learning interchangeably, because in order to build an AI, you're automatically doing it through machine learning. So how does machine learning work? Well, it automatically learns how to perform a task based on data. So you collect a lot of data surrounding that particular task that you're trying to teach a machine to do. And the machine learns the task by observing and learning from the data. And typically, if you want to build a successful AI, you need a lot of quality data, and you need a lot of computational power to be able to make sense of the data and turn it into an algorithm that actually works. So what can a narrow AI do? So there are basically three things, and they all translate from what machine learning can do. So the first and most common application is making predictions. So this is tied to a field in machine learning called the supervised learning, and this is the most successful use of AI so far. And the example of detecting objects in that image on a few slides ago, and so that's an example of making predictions, although you may not see it as making predictions, but it is. And other examples also include the product recommendation that you might see on e-commerce platforms, language translation like Google Translate, and digital assistants like Siri and Alexa. So all these things are mostly based on this kind of a narrow AI. And the second area that narrow AIs can do is uncovering general patterns in data. So this is called unsupervised learning. You're just basically mining the data and trying to find any patterns that stand out from the data set that you're working with. And often this is groundwork prior to making predictions. So usually you apply this first to learn something about the data, and then you move on to a specific task of making predictions. And some of the examples include the data compression through dimensionality reduction. So if you have multi-dimensional data, these methods can help you reduce the dimensionality. And also clustering, so you can find natural clusters that exist in the data set. And lastly, and this is the least common application area when it comes to health applications at least. So there's something called the reinforcement learning as part of machine learning that can learn optimal actions in trial and error data. Very common in some other fields, such as robotic control, autonomous vehicle control, and game playing and stuff like that. So trying to move towards a clinical decision support tool now. So what is a CDST? Well, it's an information technology that helps with decision-making at point of care. So a very broad definition. And there are different examples of this. And these things don't have to be based on AI, and they don't have to make predictions. But nowadays, a lot of the recent advances are about those. So if you I guess back in the old days, some of these tools are quite simple, so they might just send you alerts and reminders when something exceeds a threshold of some sort. You might codify or digitize clinical guidelines so that you can easily look them up and use them in patient care. Sometimes it's a simple information lookup, like looking up drug-drug interactions. Treatment recommendation, patient risk stratification, diagnosis, and prognosis. Now you're getting into more advanced uses of this kind of tool, and a lot of these tools are based on machine learning techniques nowadays. And there's no shortage of excitement around the AI, and we can also call it a hype almost. So these are some of the op-ed articles, all from JAMA, I believe, from a few years ago, that sort of drummed up the excitement around how AI is poised to solve all these problems in healthcare. A lot of it is really overly optimistic, in my opinion, but that was that. And in recent years, we've had lots of landmark studies that show the really good results coming from AI techniques. And any medical field that has a lot of imaging data have moved forward faster than other fields because they have data available. They have accumulated data for a long time, and imaging is one area that AI has been really successful. So, they took advantage of that and they moved forward quite quickly. So the examples here about dermatology and diabetic retinopathy here are all imaging applications. And these ones here are actually based on EHR data. Of course, there are lots of challenges in making anything work, in this sphere. So some of the challenges include, first of all, lack of large scale digital health data. So this is still a problem in many different areas of medicine and health in general. You have to have a large volume of good quality data to even think about building on AI. That's a starting point. And if you don't have that, then, that's a non-starter basically. And garbage in, garbage out, you need to have good quality data, not just a lot of data. And in recent years, this field has been quite concerned about biases being baked into the AI. So if the data are biased in some ways, then the AI will pick up on that and actually take advantage of it to be able to maximize the prediction performance. So you will actually, become very biased in doing that. And data privacy and security issues, obviously, because it's so data dependent. And the black box nature of AI. So the resulting AI algorithm is quite complex nowadays, and it is almost impossible to explain it, how the AI works completely. So that's why we call it a black box, and that leads to a lack of trust. So if you give such a black box to a clinician and tell them to use it, then there's obviously trust and issues with that. And unlike other fields, there's a lot more at stake in health. So we are dealing with the patient's health and lives and so on. So mistake made by an AI can be quite costly. And if you compare that to, say, the object recognition in images that you saw earlier, if you mistake a dog for a cat, for example, okay, that's a mistake, but nobody dies, right? A lot less at stake. And finally, just our limited understanding of human health in general also becomes a very challenging issue for building AI, because a lot of these other non-health applications, a lot of those problems were actually made up by humans in the first place. So, for example, robotic control, like humans built robots in the first place. So we understand how they work quite well, but, humans did not, create. So, that's a problem. Okay, so I think I'm done there. And I'm gonna ask Khara to switch over to her slide deck. But while I do that, I guess I can take questions.
So my name is Khara Sauro. I'm an assistant professor in community health science. And you'll notice there's no. So I know very little about cardiac care. So I'm here to talk more about the actual implementation science related to these tools. So what I'm hoping that you'll take away after my talk today is to understand kind of the state of implementation of clinical decision support tools, a little bit about implementation science and how it can be useful for making these very sophisticated tools applicable to the clinical context, and understand how we can leverage the same data that we're using to develop the tools to actually evaluate and implement the tools. So this is kind of reiterating some of what Joon was talking about. Why are we even talking about clinical decisions? Why should they be of interest to us? Well, there's emerging evidence, fairly robust emerging evidence, that they really can improve various aspects of quality of care. So they've been shown to improve the safety of care. A lot of the studies around this are around medication or drug-related adverse events or complications, but there's also some studies looking at using clinical decision support tools to improve glucose management in ICUs as well. They also improve processes of care, so they decrease inappropriate overuse of healthcare. They increase appropriate use of care and can make processes of care more evidence-based. And collectively, when we decrease complications and adverse events and improve processes of care, it has an effect on the dollar sign. It improves cost. An example of this is there was a study done in one single pediatric ICU where they implemented a clinical decision support tool to improve ordering of labs. So again, decreasing inappropriate use of labs, tailoring what labs need to be drawn and how frequently. And they were able to save just in one PICU in 1 year, $1 million. So it can have a really big impact on resources. And as Joon kind of alluded to, a lot of the work that's been done around clinical decision support tools has been in the area of diagnosis, and specifically around fairly well demonstrated to improve. Some studies showing that the clinical decision support tools are as good as humans. They've also really improved patient-centered care. So there's a big movement around precision health, tailoring our treatments to the right person at the right time, and using their own data and these AI methods, you can really deliver the best care for that patient at the right time. They can also, on the flip side, be used as a nice interface for incorporating the patient into the decision. So we know that they're fairly effective, but not all clinical decision support tools are made equally. So what makes a good clinical decision support tool? So there's a little bit of evidence to show us what works and what does not work when you're designing a clinical decision. So one key feature is that they're integrated into the medical record. And that kind of flows with the next 2 points, is that computer-generated decision support tools are better than kind of the checkbox paper ones. And it also relates to the fact that it needs to be at the point of decision making. It can't be something that you have to do before or after, but where you're making the decision. It's the idea of continuously improving clinical decision support tools comes next point, where when there's some documentation around why the clinical decision support tool recommendation was not followed, can then help further develop those clinical decision support tools to be more effective. They're better when they involve both the patient and the provider. And this is kind of the crux of our study, is that they're better when stakeholders or end users are involved in both the development and the implementation. And that's really what we're trying to get at, is rather than develop a tool and see what people say, we want to hear what people say right from the beginning and integrate that into the development of the tool and application into clinical practice. This is where implementation science comes into a set of tools for making clinical decision support tools better. And so just so that we're all on the same page, what is implementation? It is a set of methodologies that supports people and systems to use evidence to change practice and policy. So anybody who's worked in healthcare has probably observed quality improvement projects, interventions that use the principle of it seemed like a good idea at the time, which is fairly ineffective. And if you happen to be lucky enough to have an effective, it seemed like a good idea at the time, intervention, they're rarely sustainable. So that's where implementation science comes in. It makes it more methodological and it incorporates what we know works into the process of changing. And for this may be a familiar framework for conceptualizing implementation science. But for those who may not be familiar with it, I'll take you through. So this is our Canadian homegrown and adopted by CIHR framework for implementation science, the knowledge to action cycle. And very briefly, in the middle is our knowledge creation triangle, which starts at the very top. It's very wide and broad, and those may be less applied studies, so maybe even animal studies, single RCTs. And then at the very point is kind of a product that is distilled, so often systematic review, practice guideline. And that is the tool or product that you want to implement. So in our case, that would be the clinical decision support tool that has taken all of the evidence we're trying to generate and combining it with the AI that Joon's team is using to develop this tool. And it addresses a problem. And around the outside is the process of actually implementing a change in practice or a tool, monitoring the or evaluating the intervention and sustaining the knowledge. I'm just going to draw your attention to these two boxes because this is kind of where we are positioned with our study right now. So there's been a need and a solution in terms of have some support for decision-making around revascularization. And AI-based clinical decision support tool has been identified as a potential solution. And now we're trying to understand what is needed. We want to know what works, what doesn't work. Before we build the tool, we want from its end users what is needed. And then we want to actually roll it out into clinical practice. And that involves interventions to implement it. Implementation science, we know some general truths about what works and what doesn't work. Passive education, such as this lovely talk I'm giving right now, rarely is going to change anybody's practice. But things that are more involved, such as prompts and reminders and education outreach, audit and feedback, tend to be more effective ways of changing practice or implementing it. The one kind of solid truth that we do know in implementation science is that whatever we do needs to be tailored to the context. So there is no cookie cutter approach in implementation. Everything is tailored. The tool that you're implementing or evidence you're implementing. And there are frameworks and models to help guide this. I've referenced some of them for anyone who's interested. And how do we conceptualize context? So there is the tool itself. There are characteristics of the tool itself that are either going to be favorable or unfavorable to be used. But there is also the environment in which that tool is also being rolled out. This is a model, it's called CIFER, and it's quite nicely describes what that context is. So there's the context of the individuals who are providing care. There's what's called the inner setting, which can loosely translate to maybe like the hospital or clinical department. And then there's the outer setting, which is more of a societal political environment. Comment on our current political and environment. And this is where we come in. So we want to understand what that context is. We want to understand what the people who are going to be using this tool need, what they want it to look like. This is my first plug for our study. So you can scan this QR code. It's a very simple survey to help us understand what you need. I will not be offended if you do the survey while I'm talking. It's also not a very cognitively intense survey, so you can probably do both. You're all very smart people. But we want to hear what you need. Really, as an implementation scientist and health services researcher, I always say my job is to make your job easier, right? We're not trying to develop something that's going to be more add another step. We want to create. And in doing so, we're going to improve patient care. So what do we know so far about the Alberta context? So we have a very small number of respondents to that survey. And what we found is that about 83% of people who responded do use some clinical decision support tools in their practice. And only 33 of those were AI-based tools. So seems like there's potentially an appetite for these type of tools. And maybe AI can fill a unique gap in what exists so far. We also did what's called a World Cafe, which is just a nice word of saying we gathered end users to try and garner some information on three specific questions. So the first question is, what is the need? Like, what is challenging about clinical practice around revascularization that we can improve with a tool? And so some of the challenges that were identified by the participants in this World Cafe were data availability. So some of the common comments were, we don't have complete information on these patients. We get it very shortly before we have to make decisions about their care. And often it's incomplete. So that's one aspect that could be improved and help make decisions. Another common theme was workload and resources. So even pre-COVID, resources were tight, but even post-COVID, it's even more challenging with physician burnout, not feeling like there's time to prepare or time to make decisions. And you know, there were some comments around cost of care, but more around resources as well. Like, this patient's on the border between CABG and PCI. PCI takes less bed time, and there's another patient who maybe needs to come in, and we have a finite number of beds. So the idea of resources and workload came up. The idea of complex patients, so patient characteristics. There's patients with multimorbidity. There's also considering patient preferences that can make. And also the idea of standardization. So it was noted that there are available guidelines. However, there's still considerable variations between clinicians. And so something that addresses the standardization. Like, the next question was, do you see a place for AI clinical decision support tools in helping you make decisions? General consensus was yes. However, this is what is needed if it's actually going to be helpful. So the critical components that were identified were that it needs to be end user built. Address that component. And you know, the idea of end user built was also could also be described as making it friendly, making sure that it was at current environment at the point of decision. So making sure that it was actually usable for the clinicians. The idea of a comprehensive score output. So with little interpretation, it was quite clear what the clinical decision. It needs to be evidence informed. And I think the evidence that kind of was raised was consistent with current guidelines, but also consistent with what there were issues around data privacy, IT integrating that were raised, not particularly solutions, but that was definitely in the forefront and needs to be considered as we're developing this tool. The correct patient characteristics need to be included in. So, you know, not only, I think, variables that are identified through the machine learning, but also factors that clinicians know to be. And having something that's patient-facing was also going to be ideal. That when the decision is made, that there's a way to help communicate that to the patient, best risks, benefits with each. So some more results from our survey, looking at what are some of the barriers to rolling out a clinical decision support into clinical practice. So to orient you to this graph, we took the percent of patients that said that it had a positive response, so agree or. So the longer the bar, the less of a problem it's going to be. The shorter the bar, the more of a barrier that exists for using clinical. So you'll see that, again, support and resources is the largest barrier to rolling out one of these clinical decisions. And then other kind of barriers to implement, really around belief in they will improve patient care, they really will improve quality of care, that the benefit and risk outweigh each other. So I think, as you know, it's a good point for us to consider as we start rolling it out, to make sure that there's great transparency around the validity of the tool, which Joon and his attention to, and the credibility of the tool, so that there is there's that credibility and confidence that the And I just want to get on my soapbox as an implementation scientist for a minute and talk about evaluation, because if none of this works, we need to know. And then if it does work, we also need to know that, right? So a lot of times tools are rolled out or implemented into clinical practice, or evidence is implemented into, but we never really evaluate anything beyond. Minimal evaluation that goes into any kind of tool or intervention that's rolled out into clinical practice. And it's important to understand what benefits these resources that are going into these. And it's also important for kind of science of implementation, how we roll this out, to understand what worked and what didn't work. So thinking beyond just the impact on the patient, what was the impact on clinical practice? You know, were the clinical decision support, how many times were they used? Did it change the knowledge of clinicians who are treating these patients? And was there a change in practice? To highlight the importance of this is a study from epilepsy, a far field from cardiac science, but there were some national Scottish guidelines that were rolled out. One study tried to look at actually actively implementing these changes in clinical practice guidelines into clinical practice to see if they improved outcomes. And really the essential conclusion was, nope, didn't make any difference. These new guidelines didn't change patient or any process of care. But then when you look a little bit deeper, the way that they rolled out these guidelines was essentially an education session, like ground rounds, and the participation was only 10%. So only 10% of people even attended and were made aware that these new ways of treating patients with epilepsy were to be used. So the failure wasn't actually the guidelines. The failure was to make people aware of the guidelines and change practice. And, you know, again, going back to resources, we're in a resource-constrained environment right now. So it seems kind of maybe not of great value to put more resources to evaluating these things. But like, the good news is these amazing data sources that Joon's using to develop these tools can easily be leveraged to evaluate and our interventions to implement practice. An example of this is something that I did during my postdoctoral fellowship with Dr. Stelfox in ICU. There's an abundance of RCTs to suggest that using low molecular weight heparin is superior to unfractionated heparin for VT. Yet we know that the opposite was being done. So we had a very large implementation study to try and change clinical practice. So stop using unfractionated heparin, except for in the cases where that's actually appropriate, and start using low molecular weight heparin. It has, according to the RCTs, less VTE, less bleeding, less mortality, cheaper. So it's a win-win. So we did this implementation study. We leveraged eCritical, which is essentially loosely the same idea as Approach, but for critical care. So we didn't have to do any primary data collection. We just had to analyze data that was already in this repository. So our intervention to change practice was actually really effective. You can see here, the first graph is prescribing of low molecular weight heparin. You can see Our implementation, it was very low, and then it increased after, and the opposite was true with unfractionated. Able to change prescribing practices using our interventions. Unfortunately, there was kind of a neutral effect on patient outcomes, which is, effectiveness, but was a fairly easy way of evaluating our intervention with data that already. So to conclude, clinical decision support tools have a growing body of evidence to suggest that they are effective at improving patient outcomes as well as processes of care, but only if they're actually implemented or rolled out into clinical practice and used. That's what our study is really trying to address, is the dichotomy between what they can do and what they are doing. Just a plug to say that evaluation is critical to make sure that we're actually making. Thank you so much. And then I'll leave up this slide as well if you want to take 5 minutes. Welcome any questions. Want to answer?
So that's.
Yeah, that's what we want to know. Questions in the chat?
Yeah, sorry about that. I'll speak into the microphone. Okay, so I guess the whole idea around machine learning is that, does have some of I guess a black box feel to it, even, from the methodological standpoint. To feed the data into it, and if there are those, nuances or little differences coming from factors that are not directly captured in the data set, then I guess two things can happen. One is if those are crucial in making predictions, have them, then there's a limitation of the, or second, like I said, if there are other proxies that are related to that factor, which is not directly captured, then the algorithm will try to, use that. So until you actually see the results, you actually don't know. Once you have an algorithm built, you'll have, and there are explainability tools that allow you to look at like which variables were important. Have to make sense of that. It's a very difficult part, and it's an active area of research.
Chance for the, are there any questions on the audience out there? If you just want to put them in the chat, that would be great. If not, we will close this session and thank our speakers for the presentation. Very much.
Thank you so much.